and we just want to share with you the summer school. We've had quite a few more applications that have come through from the advertisement in U3A Matters, which is really lovely. So we are now nearly full. So if anybody else is thinking of joining from the group, this would be a very good time to join us. And the planning group have worked very hard. This is not really my work, I have to confess, particularly Janet, but everybody on the team has contributed towards the provisional timetable, which I sent out last night on the reminder. So you can see there's quite a wide range of things at the summer school there. So on the first morning and the last morning, we've put on optional visits because we realise that some people are travelling long journeys and you might not be able to make those bits. But for the people who can get there in that time, there's a trip to a materials recycling facility and a trip to an energy solar farm as well, community energy. So those should be interesting extras. We've got a walk in the local woods. We're hoping to link with a wildlife trust for that. We've got some games. We've got climate fresque. So that's a workshop, a 3-hour workshop, should really help all of us sort of learn a bit more. We've got speakers and we've got some quite eminent people. So we've tried to use the local speakers. So we've got Dr. Stephen Norrie from Stratford Climate Action and Net Zero Stratford. Sarah Steer, Head of Climate Change and Sustainability at Warwickshire County Council. We've got our very own Dr. Janet Palmer and Dr. Keith Richards, who are talking about the Stratford-upon-Avon Climate Hub. We've got John Stott from the Heart of England Community Energy Electricity and Bob Sherman. So there's quite a few links there to the visit on the last morning. And around that, we've got lots of chances to discuss things, to look at things, get ideas for any groups that you run at home, and some short films to give you ideas as well and to get us talking and thinking. I don't know if any of the other planning team want to say anything about the timetable.
I'd just add, Ellie, that for anybody who hasn't been on any of our previous summer schools or met up in person, it's so energizing. You know, it's just so good, isn't it, to meet with like-minded people and to be able to share your ideas and find out from other people. You know, the previous meetings, I've come away feeling really, really enthusiastic about it all. I do recommend it to you. And it's a lovely place to stay. You know, the conference centre at Warwick University, you know, it's top class. It's not student accommodation, it's conference accommodation. So, you know, it's a holiday with a completely 100% purpose.
Okay. Thank you. And huge thanks to the planning group who are continuing to meet to put the fine detail on it. And especially to like Janet, our woman on the site, who's done a lot of the legwork for us. This morning, our member Helen Howard is with us, who often has a clashing appointment. She's prioritised us today, and she's been to the Ethical Consumer conference. So she's just going to say a few words about that for us.
Thank you. I feel I want to apologise for the picture. I look as though I'm sitting in the dark, but I'm not. The sun's out.
I think it's just the lights behind you, isn't it?
It's sideways. Anyway, can't really see me at all, but maybe that's a good thing. So I went to this conference on the 8th of November because it was on degrowth, and I thought, what's that? I mean, I had a general idea what it was about because I had skimmed Kate Rayworth's book, Donut Economics, I didn't read it from cover to cover. So I had grasped that the essence of the problem was that the prosperity and success of a nation is measured in GDP, gross domestic product, which means that your contribution to society, for example, looking after someone who needs care, is only counted if you get paid for it. And most businesses are primarily set up to make money rather than to benefit society. The conference gave me a much better understanding because everyone there was from an organisation that contributed to society in many different ways. Some mostly local, but we also had some international contributors as well. And what I came away with was the understanding that actually we're doing quite a lot of this already, or bits of it. Perhaps we just need to do more of it. So it's things like cooperative housing, which involves the pooling of funds to buy or to build. Businesses running with a cooperative structure. And of course, you are allowed to make money. It's just that you're not allowed to make so much money that the chief executive has 4 houses, 2 yachts, and a private jet. On a local level, so shared ownership of stuff, in inverted commas, which can be borrowed or rented for very little. So tools are sort of things that you only need occasionally. And one example was plastic children's party goods. You only need it once or twice a year. Why has every family got a set that you then can't get rid of after they've grown up and left home? Repair cafes and Skillshare workshops. For example, you show me how to make jam and chutney, and I'll show you how to make vegetable ferments and kefir, which I did last couple of weeks ago. On an international level, that there was a group that were persuading battery manufacturers to make more use of recycled scarce minerals so that we don't need more mines. And another one on mining, working with mining companies to get them to minimise their impact on the environment and maximise the benefits for local people. At the end, we were asked what actions would you want governments to take, and there were 3 things that people said. Make sure that rights over land in other countries are maintained. So in other words, stop foreign investors taking over tracts of land so that local people can no longer live there or make their living there, so they become migrant workers and ripe for exploitation. The second one was about cancelling the debt of developing countries. A lot of when people are promised money, it's often a loan, not a grant, which just gets them into a hole they can't dig themselves out of. And stop subsidising fossil fuel companies and stop their development. The personal action that was recommended was join a campaigning group. And the book they recommend is by a Jason Hickel. I'll put these names in the chat. And the book is called Less is More. That's about degrowth. Might be a good speaker, perhaps.
Helen, thank you so much. That is really interesting, and sort of hits lots of other topics that we have already talked about. But I think, yes, talk on degrowth sounds very timely. And there's the book. Terry's holding it up for us.
Listen.
Thank you.
She obviously got the memo.
I've ordered it for Christmas.
Brenda has taken over from Ian as organising our talks for next year. And we've come across one that we'd like to do that's going to take more than our normal session. So we're going to add in a session or just for a single item. And Brenda's just going to tell you about that now.
Hi, yes, thank you very much. 2 or 3 of you came forward with a recommendation for the film 6 Inches of Soil, which is basically what we have spread around the planet to sustain everybody. And we, as we heard last month from our speaker, we abuse this terribly. it's a full-length-ish film. So Ellie and Jenny decided that we should actually watch this in our own time, and then use not a monthly meeting, but a dedicated special meeting to come together and discuss it if you've been one of the people who watched it. So I'm popping the details in the chat there right now. So on the 19th of February, we will come together. I will by then have sent you the link to the film, which is free to view, and you'll be able to turn up having done your homework and ready to discuss. So if you'd like to just pop that date of the 19th of February, which is a Wednesday morning, into your diary for next year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brenda. Sounds very interesting too. Lots of you 3As will know all about transitioning websites, and guys, it's happened to us as well. Teresa's going to tell us a little bit about this.
Thank you. Well, it's happening at the moment. It's not completed, so we're still in the process of being migrated to a new website service, and it will be completed certainly by the end of December. When we have migrated to the new website, if the link changes at all, you will no doubt get an email with the new link. In the meantime, we're using the old website. And I suppose the only thing I would add to that is that part of our information on the website, I think most of the stuff around resources and toolkit has been migrated, but you won't see that. You will still be looking at that on the old website when you go to log on. That's about it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Teresa. And the last of the updates that I've got today is really just to let you know that our core group is changing a little bit. We have a rolling programme of people coming on to help us organise these sessions, and then leaving again when they feel ready. And we've got 2 people leaving us this month who both contributed a huge amount to running this group. So I'd particularly just like to thank Catherine. Give us a wave, Catherine. Where are you? And Ian as well. Ian's going to continue doing our news next year, but is stepping down from the core group. So both of them, huge thanks for what they've contributed to us being able to hold these meetings. So now I'm handing over to Jenny to take us through the next part of the session.
Thank you, Ellie. For everybody apart from our brand new members here, you will know that the regular format has been for Ian to give us an update, usually about, about 10 minutes or so, of what's been happening all over the world, condensed into 10 minutes. And that has been, for all of us, incredibly thorough and useful to have that quick summary. Excuse me, my throat's playing up. Sorry. But because we've had the latest COP, we decided that we would like to expand Ian's contribution today. So we asked him a couple of months ago if he'd be prepared to do a whole feedback thing for us on COP29. So we're very, very grateful to you, Ian. I know, all of this is a massive amount of work, looking at all the different things that are going on. And on Ian's last slide, he's got some topics for discussion for our breakout rooms. So huge thank you to Ian. Me just looking at some of the stuff that's come out of COP, has been a massive undertaking for you to really get your head around it all. Hats off to you. So thank you, Ian. Sorry, I forgot to say, please don't put anything in the chat while Ian is giving his presentation, because it's just too distracting. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jenny. I'll run through my summary of the COP, which I followed closely and went through a number of documents. Get a view, share my slide. Okay, let's go on to slideshow. Yeah, so hopefully you can all see that. Yes, COP29, not the most successful of COPs, I would say, but nevertheless, it was an opportunity for the leaders to get together. So there were 198 governments represented, although India was a no-show, and the US contingent was actually quite small following the Trump election results. So we know what's going to happen there. But and it had a number of environmental groups, NGOs. It had United Nations agencies there, regional organizations, business and industry groups. No doubt some of them talking about fossil fuels, but never mind, at least they were there. We had indigenous people, which is always colourful, which is good fun. Youth and civil society. So there are around about 65,000 people there, not all physically, some of them online as well. So it was the second largest COP in the end. So there was plenty of representation. Well, that was good. So just a bit of background. As you can see from the graph, and you've seen this many times before, CO2 emissions are still rising, not as fast as they were. In fact, China should be going carbon neutral by next year, and they are a very large emitter. So, but overall CO2 emissions are still going up. So by the end of the century, the projection on current policies is something like a 2.5 to 2.9 degree rise by the end of the century, unless something radical changes. The pledges, from the countries give us around about a 2 degree rise. So if countries could stick to their pledges, that things wouldn't be quite so bad. But unfortunately, they make the pledges and most of them get ignored. So we end up in this blue area. But nevertheless, the COP is an opportunity, for people to talk to each other and hopefully name and shame some of them, to actually reduce their emissions. So that's why this is important, because the climate is going to change a lot. And the COP is one way of coordinating activities and setting objectives. So the importance of political leadership, it's ever so important. The technology, we've got lots of technology. Technology is not the issue. The issue is political leadership. That is the big issue, and that's the big blocker. So, and the COP is where we get the leaders all together, or at least their representatives, opportunity to talk and engage. Once the politics is sorted out, everything else will follow. Basically the large companies will follow what their local government is telling them to do. Individuals will follow. Individuals have never been that much of a problem, but it's all about the politics. So that's why the COP is so important. So having 198 countries represented, apart from India, was a positive move. So what was actually agreed? The finance, they definitely made progress on finance. So the pledges from developing countries from developed countries into developing countries increased from 100 billion a year to US dollars to 300 billion a year, which is a big increase, and that will be paid by 2035. So that's a 3 times increase, and it'll help these countries introduce technologies, new technologies, green technologies, and also help them adapt to climate change, because the climate is changing. But it was unclear whether that would all be paid next year or whether that is a target for 2035. The incremental increase from 100 billion a year to 300 billion a year was not specified. So that was something that was definitely missing. So, they could stay at 100 billion a year and then suddenly increase it in 2035. I mean, I don't think that's what will happen, but it just wasn't clear how the increments were going to be introduced. Having said that, the developing countries were not particularly happy because they'd asked for $1.3 trillion a year to fight climate change, which is about the right sort of number. That's my understanding. That is the sort of number that they actually need. So they're getting about a quarter of it. So you can see pressure in the coming COPs, to try and increase this 300 billion to a larger number. So next year, perhaps an opportunity to do that. But 1.3 trillion is probably what's needed. So it's progress, but it's not exactly what we need. And also, what about inflation? No one talked about inflation. So how much will $300 a year, $300 billion, how much will it actually be worth in 2035? So the financial arrangements will need to be addressed again in future COPs. But, it was progress. Carbon trading was probably one of the successes of this COP. So the idea is that there's agreement reached on carbon trading under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So it basically sets the rules for carbon trading. So rich countries buy carbon credits from poor countries. So money goes into the poor countries, which they then use to invest in green energy. And the savings in those poor countries counts against the carbon targets of the rich countries. So it's a bit of a halfway house, really. It kind of gets things moving. And so it's a step in the right direction. It is a good thing. But in the past, it's been marred by accounting methods being unclear and opaque. So what they've done is put some rules in place to enable carbon trading, to be transparent. And the whole process will be overseen by the United Nations. So that was real progress on carbon trading. So we'll wait and see how that works in practice. So that, I think, was one success from the COP. Emission reductions, discussions about the NDCs, which is the carbon reduction targets. It was ongoing, obviously, in the conference. The UK made a very strong contribution, and Keir Starmer actually turned up in person, which was good. Mostly you get representatives rather than the actual leaders to turn up to these things. And he said that the UK is going to reduce its emissions by 81% by 2035, compared to 1990 levels. Which is good. It's a good target. It's a target that was recommended by the CCC, so they've just basically adapted that target. Now, how that's going to be achieved is not clear. I've not seen the plans. You can read the CCC documents, and that gives various alternative ways to getting to 81%. But they do need to announce it by February next year, which is when the NDCs all need to be formally submitted. This NDC was submitted ahead of time, probably for political reasons. But nevertheless, it looked good. But what we need is the plans. What we need is the implementation plan. And we'll get more from that in February. So 3 countries submitted NDCs ahead of time. They're obviously enthusiastic. Brazil, because they're hosting the COP next year, so they made a big effort. Yemen, for some reason, came up with theirs as well, which is good. So that leaves 195 countries to submit their NDCs by February. And the NDC is a target plus a plan. You've got to have a plan. What's missing is independent assessments of the success of the implementation of those plans. We're still relying on the governments themselves, to say what they're doing. there's no independent verification. So that is something I think where the COPs could be improved. Phasing out fossil fuels, which was adopted last year, that was not formally adopted this year, so they backed away a bit from that. It does appear in one of the annexes somewhere, but it's sort of hidden away, and it's not a feature. So they've really backed away from this agreement, to phase out fossil fuels, and that was led mainly by Saudi Arabia bloc, basically, and supported by the other petro states. So they backed away. So that was a negative. That was dropped. The clean energy transition, having said that, is ongoing. There's a target to have 3 times renewable energy by 2030. I'll just show the diagram for that. So you can see this is increasing renewable energy. This is solar energy is increasing extremely quickly because that's getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. The solar energy is definitely the way forward. Not so much in this country because we have less sun and more wind, so we're sort of focusing on our wind. But wind plus solar, it's moving up very quickly. It's not meeting the 3 times target, but at least it's moving in the right direction. So that's a fairly positive news story, I would say, on that one. Let's go back to the previous slide. They also agreed, so this 3 times has been agreed. They also agreed to increase energy storage because you need energy storage when the sun's not shining, wind's not blowing. We need a massive amount of energy storage as we go to green technology. So the target is to deploy 1,500 gigawatts globally by 2030, which is 6 times the current capacity of energy storage. So that's a good move, and that will then have to continue to increase as we go forward. Okay, so that was agreed. So that was a positive. They also agreed a target to add or refurbish 25 million kilometers of power grids across the world by 2030, rising to 65 million kilometers by 2040. So there was a recognition that the power grids are not fit for purpose, and the power grids, because electrification is increasing at such a rate that all the power grids need to be upgraded. And they're also taking power in from multiple sources, so they need to also have intelligence in the power systems. So the whole power grid, including the UK, needs a massive overhaul. So they've agreed in principle that this will happen across the globe. So most countries signed up for that. There's also a target of 3 times nuclear power. Nuclear power has got a sort of new lease of life at the moment. So that's been agreed to increase by a factor of 3. We are seeing that in the UK with Hinkley Point and Sizewell, and also these small modular reactors are being introduced, partially to power the growing AI industry, which needs an awful lot of power. So nuclear power provides a base load. So it is important. Along with hydrogen, hydrogen's also being ramped up, and other technologies are also being ramped up. So the clean energy transmission, there was pretty much general agreement on that. Methane is a gas which is 60 times worse than CO2 in terms of trapping heat, but it's relatively short-lived because it oxidizes. So you tend to get a burp of methane, which has a big impact, and then it gradually tails away. So more than 30 countries have now agreed targets to reduce their methane emissions. So, and this is part of the overall global methane pledge to reduce methane emissions by 1/3 by 2030. And these can now be measured from satellites. You can actually measure this, so countries can't just do it and ignore it. So we got some sort of independent verification of that through satellite observations. Deforestation, there was really no progress. They didn't really talk about it. Tropical deforestation accounts for 20% of human-caused CO2 emissions. This is expected to be a major theme in the COP next year in South America, which is branded the sort of Nature's COP, but it wasn't really talked about in this COP. All right, so sort of mixed results on emissions. Now, climate adaptation, there was really not a lot was done. It wasn't talked about very much. Now, last year, at the previous COP, they agreed an adaptation framework, a sort of framework for adaptation, which can be used by individual countries to adapt to individually, to climate change. All countries are sort of slightly different, but an overall framework which includes things like agriculture, protection of infrastructure, ecosystems, and so on, had been agreed last year, and that was expected to move forward this year. But it didn't, mainly because of the money. The problem was that the amount of adaptation depends largely on how much money you put into it, and how much do we spend on adaptation. In the UK, we underspend on adaptation. We don't spend nearly enough adapting our climate. Neither do any other countries. That they're all fall behind on adaptation. But there was no progress at this COP because the amount of money wasn't agreed until the final hours anyway. So this this whole day session, didn't know how much money it had to spend. So it basically didn't make any progress. So we look forward to big progress on that next year's COP. Agriculture and food security, again, there wasn't much progress. They have set up a sort of web portal for sharing information, so that was the only progress on that, which any country can access and share information. So that's a slightly positive thing. Protection of infrastructure, again, limited progress. They produced a thing called the MAP Declaration for Resilient and Healthy Cities, which is a sort of list of requirements for healthy cities. So that will hopefully move forward next year into more detailed conversations. Right, so not much on adaptation, very little. Climate justice, again, this is about the just transition to low carbon economy. So at the moment, the rich countries are adapting, certainly in the EU, not fast enough, but at least we are doing something. But the poor countries really are struggling with this. It's just some sort of general principles about climate justice, how we do the transition to a green economy in a fair and equal way without exploiting all these poor countries. And also includes job losses. During the transition, jobs are going to change, but there will be new jobs created through the green industry. So there's that transitions, to green working, green jobs. Filling the skill gaps. There's actually a shortage of people with green expertise. So there's big education programs needed there. And there's a lot of differences country to country. So it's all about a just transition, having a sort of plan which countries can use, but there was no progress on it anyway. Gender climate actions, again, about getting women involved in decision-making progress. And again, there was no progress there. In fact, in Azerbaijan, the committee that looked after the climate change had got no women on it. And then the Carbon Brief pointed this out to them about a year ago, and they brought one or two on. So that was again, but there's gender action plan bringing in intergenerational and women. There was no progress on that. Now this sort of mimics, in fact, there was a COP at the biodiversity COP was held a month earlier in South America, which I also followed, and it came up with very similar results. You know, all the things that are preventing progress in the COPs it applied to this biodiversity COP as well. So all the problems. It was all about the money and not being able to find enough money. So on the previous COP, just to talk about it briefly, there was a global biodiversity framework had been put in place, but that was not agreed. That would protect 30% of the land and sea areas by 2030, but that was not agreed. Only a fifth of the countries came up with national biodiversity plans. Biodiversity metrics were not agreed. What are we actually going to measure? What are we going to monitor? How are we going to track biodiversity? That was not agreed. Finance, they reckon they needed 200 billion US dollars a year, you know, to fight biodiversity, and that was not agreed. And indigenous people, that was agreed. Technology transfer for things like genetic editing, that sort of thing, that was agreed. So again, the biodiversity COP the year before had exactly the same problems and came up with sort of quite similar results. So there's something here that we need to fix. Now, how can we make these COPs better? So looking ahead to next year's COP, which is in Brazil, in Belém, which is a sort of a tropical city, pretty much on the equator. So it'll be nice and warm for somebody. November next year. So all countries will have to submit their NDCs by February this year. So there will be a lot to talk about on reductions in emissions, because we'll have all the numbers out, will be out, and they'll be able to talk about those. So I think next year's COP will focus on emission reductions. We should also get a much more focus on climate adaptation, because there was really no progress this year. You know, so that has to get better. And now the finance, at least, that has been agreed. Then I think adaptation will be able to move forward. And I'm sure they will review the finance again next year and try and increase it. It does need to be increased. And they will also be looking at evaluating this carbon market mechanism, which has now been agreed. They put the rules in for that, so they should have some examples of that to talk about next year. There's some uncertainties. Obviously, we're expecting the US to pull out of the climate talks, or at least send a much smaller delegation next year. So the US is pretty much going to pull out for the duration of the Trump presidency. That's what's expected. Maybe he'll have a change of heart, but I'd rather doubt that. So that could leave a big hole for China to come in and fill the gaps. Maybe we'd like China to take some leadership of these COPs. Now, China are not natural leaders. They don't really lead things. They tend to do an awful lot in the background. So I can't see that happening. So there could be a place, for the European Union to take much more of a leadership role. But since the COP will be in Brazil, I think we can expect Luno, the presidents of Brazil, to take again a much bigger lead going forward. So I'm fairly optimistic for next year's COP, because it is a major COP. A major COP is every 5 years when they update the NDCs. So I would expect much more to happen next year than happen this year. So that leaves kind of three questions. What are the positive outcomes from COP29? What were the positives? And should richer countries pay the $1 trillion each year, £1 million each year, to help the poorer countries fight climate change? That's mitigation and adaptation. Should we increase from 300 billion to a trillion, which, to be honest, is what they need? So how's that going to happen? Should that happen? How's that going to happen? it's in our long-term interest. Otherwise, we're just going to end up with massive migration. And how can the COP be more effective next year? And some sort of ideas. How can we make it more effective? What needs to change? It is a massive talking shop. Everybody does turn up, but how can we improve the mechanism and get more results from next year's COP? Okay, I'll stop sharing there. Thank you. I think you're on mute, Jenny. Yeah.
Thank you, Ian. We've got time for questions now. So if you are able to raise your virtual hand, it helps enormously because it puts you in a queue. And Ellie, you're mute. Yeah, carry on, Ellie.
Ian, can you clarify for me? You've talked about carbon credits and the rich countries buying carbon credits off the poor ones. Is that linked in any way to this £1 trillion, or are they completely separate things?
Yeah, it's a separate thing. It's seen as a separate process. Now, of course, you know, if they're falling short on one, they may try and mix it, but legally, it is a separate and entirely separate process. And they've been trying to do it for years, but they can never agree the rules. So it's a kind of marketing thing. You know, it's in everyone's best interest as a marketing activity, but it's completely separate from the just handing over money, which we also need to do in massive quantities. And the thing is, with handing the money over, you can't just hand it over to these. You've got to manage it. You've got to manage how it's used. So the United Nations oversees this money, and the United Nations needs to actively participate and make sure it's spent in the way it's meant to be spent. Part of the reluctance in handing more money over is we're not quite sure how it's going to be used. You know, how they're going to use it. We don't want it ending up in the pockets of the leaders. So the whole process does need to be managed far, far better.
Thank you, Ian. Charles?
Yes, just to say, Professor Rachel Warren, who is a professor of global change and environmental biology at the Tyndale Centre for Climate Change Research at UEA, spoke at our local cathedral on the 20th of November. She was in Paris and said at that point the science only provided evidence for 2 degrees. It was the politicians who decided on 1.5. So there are times when the politicians are ahead of the scientists.
Yeah, I think the United Nations, the IPCC prediction is currently 3.1 degrees, but the overall is 2.6 to 2.9.
Yes, this was the IPCC findings at the time of Paris.
Okay.
So
yeah.
At that time, they only could support 2 degrees.
Yeah, I mean, people just throw numbers in, you know, just to muddy the waters. But the consensus is it's 2.6 to 2.9.
Sure. I'm just trying to say she was there at the time. She was part of the group producing the IPCC reports and the evidence. And the evidence wasn't there for 1.5 degrees. It was only there for 2.
Yeah, we're well past 1. Yeah.
Catherine, you had your hand up and it's gone down. Have you got a question?
Yes. I didn't consciously put it down. I just want to endorse what Ian says about the anxiety of this money, that it's such a big number. What does that mean for the donor countries and the mechanisms to make sure that it doesn't get filched off into all sorts of nefarious things? I think is a real anxiety. And secondly, I just wanted to draw anybody's attention who didn't see it last night. There was a program on BBC One at 9 o'clock about the environmental costs of flying. And I would strongly recommend that you pick that up on catch up on BBC One. Thank you.
Nick, thanks, Catherine. Nick, you're muted, Nick. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just wondering if there's any knowledge about how the how the UN select the host country for each COP, because the last two have been in
Yeah,
oil countries. I'm not sure whether Egypt is as well. That'll be three in a row.
yeah, it was done. It was allocated onto the regional basis. Exactly how they reach that allocation is one of the dark arts, I think. But yeah, we've had three successive COPs in petro-states, and that has not been especially helpful, because certainly Saudi Arabia just basically tried to block everything, and the others were kind of half and half. Moving to Brazil is a positive step, although Brazil itself does produce huge amounts of petrol, but I think their leadership is very strongly behind the COP. So it's a regional basis. And the one afterwards is either going to go to Turkey or Australia. They're arguing about who's going to have it in 26. So it's done on a sort of regional basis, And yeah.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Steve?
Hello. Yeah, I mean, I wanted to congratulate Ian on ploughing through a massive amount of material. It must have taken you day and night, Ian. I just want to pick up on one of your early comments, which was, analysing why we don't get more progress. And of course, you quite correctly say, because there isn't enough political will. But of course, we have to unpack why there isn't more political will. Maybe this is something for the breakout rooms. But of course, politicians are not going to do things which are going to lose their next election knowingly, are they? So you actually have to have a groundswell. You've got to have an informed electorate that is requiring their politicians. Now, what the politicians can do realistically is try and clamp down on misinformation and disinformation. I mean, one of the things I would like our government to do is have a major public information campaign fronted by climate scientists mainly, not fronted by politicians, possibly paid for out of government money. So, I think you've got to sort of be careful about criticising the lack of political will. It's us that has to create the political will.
Yeah. No, that's fine. Yeah, I think what I'd like to see is that the governments to produce a plan. I mean, the UK said that they're going to get to 81% reduction by February, by 2030 or 2035, whichever date you choose. I think they brought it forward to 2030, but there's no plan behind that. There's no plan. If you ask them how they're going to do it, they'll kind of wave their hands towards what the CCC has produced, which is one or two different options. So I'm looking forward. I believe there has to be a proper plan out by February next year as part of the NDC process. So I'm looking forward to see the government plan for how we're going to get this 81% reduction, and that takes it out of the hands of the politicians. Once you've got a plan, then they'll hopefully stick to that plan. But they're very real. These plans, and you've got to look at it and say, well, how concrete is it? So, and that's where we need to push back on them. These plans have got to be really substantial with milestones and money attached to them, and so all the rest of it. I mean, I used to be a program manager, and that's exactly what you need to do, and that would then take it out of the hands of the politicians to a large degree. But yeah. So
Thank you.
I'm a little bit hard on politicians, but
Brenda.
Yeah, thanks. I just think it's very easy to get bogged down in these huge numbers that actually can mean very little to us. It's you know, people use that term monopoly numbers, don't they? And that's what this can end up being. And we can even lose track of when we're talking about billions and when we're talking about trillions. I think what is really disappointing is that this COP was right from the outset known as the finance COP, and that Azerbaijan, as the organising country on this occasion, completely failed to broker early discussions. You know, it's their job when someone is running the COP to open up those conversations with people like India, China, US, petrostates, etc., so that when they arrive at your COP, they have some formulated ideas ready to put on the table and discussions to have. And by all accounts, that failed completely. The COP was then opened by the president of Azerbaijan, who talked about fossil fuels as a God-given blessing. And so, you know, things did not get off to a good start. And there is little wonder, really, why finance never really got off the ground, why most developing nations went home really angry, actually, about the failure of people to support them, not only in dealing with climate change, but perhaps, you know, more greedily, also failing to support them in not further contributing to climate change as their economies start to develop. Because if we don't support them, then they will fall into exactly the same traps as we did through our industrial era. And then to cap it all, on Monday, I think it was, the Azerbaijan COP president wrote an opinion piece in The Guardian, throwing all blame upon everybody else, and ourselves included, after their complete failure to run a decent COP.
Yeah, quite. John, have you got something?
Yes, I've seen a lot of criticism coming from developing countries that a significant amount of this 300 billion is going to come in the form of loans rather than grants. Now, and a lot of them, I think, are very worried about this because all they think it's going to do is to increase their indebtedness, and they can't pay their debts, their existing debts at the moment, some of them. Do you have any comments on that? Do you have any actual figures on how much is likely to come from loans?
Yeah, no, I've heard that as well. There'll be a mixture of loans and grants and various other mechanisms. It's not been published. They've not published the details. All they've published is the headlines, as far as I can see. So there's more work needs to be done on that. Yeah, it's not a straight grant. It should be a straight grant because you know, this is so urgent that you can't mess about with it, and there's no way they'll ever be able to pay those loans back. So just forget about loans. It's just the way the Western banks work.
Okay.
So if we take, sorry, Ian, if we take one last question from Idris, and then Ian, before we go into the breakout rooms, if you could just put the questions on your slide on the screen again. But Idris.
Yes, thank you. I'm going back a step because I lost my hand. I don't know where it went to. The whole concept of a carbon market, is it valid? I don't think it is. And I think it's been supported for what you might call ulterior means. There's no real depth of activity in a carbon market. It's all superficial. That's my take on it anyway, and I put that to you.
I agree. I mean, I've always been a bit suspicious about carbon markets. It's never been high on my list of. It's been driven, but I think by the Chinese. The Chinese are very keen on carbon markets, but they do because they see it as a way of getting into the third world and being more influential and making lots of sales of their technology. And their technology, their solar panels are very, very good, and they're very, very cheap. But it's all part of the carbon markets, and I've always been a little bit suspicious about carbon markets because all the double counting. But now, at least they seem to have got some rules in place now, to clamp down on it and make them work properly. So we'll have to wait and see. We'll have to wait and see.
Right, friends, I'm stopping the questions now, and we're going to move into the breakout room so that you've got a chance to do a lot more discussion in a small group. You should have about 4 or 5 people in each group. I will stop them again at 1:15. So then you'll get that little timer giving you 60 seconds to finish off whatever anybody is saying, and you can come back into the main room then. So the questions that we'll be focusing on are the ones on your screen now. And I think Ian's going to copy those into the chat, so you should be able to see those when you go into your breakout rooms. So if you do have any more questions for Ian, when we come back into the main session, you can type madly into the chat, and Jenny will sort of pull out anything that we need to address before we close our meeting. Okay, so here we go into the breakout rooms.
Welcome back, everybody. I'll just share this with you before we see a few things that have been put in the chat. Earlier this week, the organisation Carbon Brief gave a webinar, and there were 6 young experts who had been there at the COP, and they each gave a little summary of the bit of the negotiations that they had been tracking. And then there were lots of questions from people, all over the world. And one of the questions that was chosen was Ian's question about climate adaptation. Ian, I didn't feel that the answer was. You muted, Ian.
Yeah, I should have asked them the question, why was adaptation so difficult, and why did they make kind of zero progress on it? And she just went through the mechanism. She didn't explain why.
Yeah.
And I think the reason was because it came down to the money, and at the time, and the money was not agreed until the last minute anyway. So they didn't really have, and that kind of stymied the adaptation progress. So yeah, I thought it was a good question to ask anyway, because it was like zero progress on it.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm just looking at the chat here. One group thought that the UK and China both came out of it well, and in spite of what you said, Ian, about China not previously taking the lead, we hope that perhaps they might, particularly if the US is back enough, they might think this is their chance to shine. Solar panels shining, pardon the pun. And groups spent time, talking about how the money is paid, and we know that this is a problem, isn't it? Managing the grants and the loans is a massive problem, and we know historically when money has been given to countries for famine relief, huge amounts, have been mismanaged. So it is a big problem. One group said here we went off on tangents off the question, but that doesn't matter because we're discussing the topics, aren't we, as they come into our heads. Nick's put here that it might be of interest to know that the UN is going to manage finance for developing countries. There are lots of different UN agencies that are responsible for that. It's all very, very, very complex. And then we've got various comments about stopping subsidies for fossil fuels. you know, for like aero flights and stuff like that, for petrol and diesel for cars. And then you come back to the problem of people in developed countries, you know, they're talking about the cost of living all the time. And if these subsidies are going to be revoked, politicians are going to get extremely nervous, aren't they? One group here suggested a cross-party consensus to remove the problem of political parties, always thinking about the next election. Catherine, do you want to say a bit more about that?
It wasn't me that said that, but I think it's absolutely essential, and that's why the Committee on Climate Change is so important, because that is lifted above party politics. And I've always felt that they should have much, much more power and actually say something that had to be followed, whatever government was in power. Anyway, I've tried hard by writing to Rishi Sunak and Starmer over a year ago. I didn't get anywhere, needless to say. Rishi Sunak didn't even have the courtesy to respond in any way whatsoever, not even an acknowledgement.
No.
Thank you, Catherine. One group here has put down that they found it difficult to identify any positives from this year's COP, other than that some progress has been made on finance. Have the COPs just been too big? The group that I was in, we talked about that, the massive number of delegates, the size of the whole site, you know, trying to get from one end of the site to the other on a bicycle. Is it just like too much for anybody to take in? And I know, you know, this split up into different sections, but it is just such a massive thing. So identifying the positives, I don't know if you agree with this, but I sort of think, Ian, I sort of think identifying the negatives and the problems is a positive, because it, you know, it means that we've got something to work on, something to focus on. Catherine, you've got your hand up again.
I just think that to have had in both the last two COPs all these people from the oil industry is so immoral. I can hardly bear it. They should have had obviously some representatives of all kinds of business, but to flood it with people from the oil industry is totally immoral.
Yeah. There's we had quite a good idea with the post office scandal. It got publicity through a soap, didn't it? You know, so maybe we could have some soap, you know, climate change on Coronation Street or something, you know, to get it into people's heads that there is actually something happening here, and that might be actually quite effective.
Well, the Archers has a go from time to time.
Yeah, I think we'd expect the Archers would, but you know, get something from some of the others, especially on TV.
EastEnders.
Yeah, well.
Yeah. We've got a comment down here. Can UN not organise the conference but still allow it to be hosted in different places with an independent organiser? So I suppose the idea of that is splitting it up, maybe across the year, because in my group we were saying, you know, you've got the COP in November this year, and then another one in next November, and obviously we want lots to happen in those 12 months, but will stuff happen? Who's monitoring it? Charles?
A lot happens between one year and another, and the COP you're referring to is just one of a number of COPs. So, for example, earlier in November time, there was a COP about biodiversity.
Yes.
There's other COPs that go on that deal with plastics. So there are a lot of conferences going on, and there are meetings with the ones to do with climate change in between the annual meetings. All I can say is that what happened back in Rio in '92, it was decided that the United Nations should run it, and to get the science sorted first. So that was the priority set then that was achieved by 96, and then to what extent the humans were affecting it was a secondary matter that was clear by around 2002. But I think that there isn't another organisation that can be easily brought into place to run it. Let alone that there's going to be any consensus about the 198 countries about attending a breakaway organisation. And you sit as well with the IPCC work, that there are 760 scientists who work on that. If you set up a different entity, how are they going to be paid? How do they transfer across? I mean, it takes years to set these things up.
Yeah.
Yeah. Brenda's put from her group, talking about this massive amount of money that needs to come from somewhere, that she's put it that it could easily be raised from fossil fuel companies, aviation and shipping. It doesn't have to come out of taxpayers' pockets. And Ian?
Yes, I think we should get the fossil fuel companies should be paying for this, you know, because they're causing the problem, and that they ought to be somehow get them to pay. It's not easy, but it has to be done because they're making huge profits, and they're also being subsidized as well, which is completely bonkers.
Yeah. Now we've got loads of comments in the chat, and if you want to save the chat, if you just go up to the three little dots at the top of the chat column, you can save it, because they are quite interesting to look through, you know, a bit later on when you've some time and absorbed all this. And they're also quite good questions if you have your own climate group in your home U3A, you know, and you wanted a few questions to spark a bit of debate or have a little questionnaire or something like that. You know, some ideas will definitely spring out of that chat for you. So I'm sort of like going away from this thinking we've covered lots of ground, haven't we? We know lots about COP. We know what we would like to happen next year at COP. And we just have to keep our finger on the pulse here, don't we, really? Keep finding out more about this and finding out how we can, to what extent, influence, if we can at all. There won't be a meeting in December because the last Friday in December, you know, it's too much about Christmas and New Year and stuff like that. So the next one of these meetings will be on January the 31st. Seems such a long way away, doesn't it? And Anne McGarry is going to talk to us about the ecological footprint and the insights that it has given us. So that's going to be another really good, useful, helpful session. Ellie, before we close, is there anything else that needs to be said, shared?
No, I don't think so. Just thank you to everybody who's made this session such a success. And as soon as the recording is ready, we will put out an email so that you know, and anybody who's not present can find it. And Ian's slides will be on the recording. And Ian, we can use those slides with our groups, can't we?
Yes.
Which, you know, is very helpful. You've got the right information there with Ian's slides. So yes, thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of the day. Have a good weekend. Try not to be too depressed.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.